Hello, everyone. We're just giving a few more minutes, another minute or two, for more people to join in. So sit tight for a minute, and we will be starting with our webinar shortly. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started now, and I'm going to count on our one of our co-hosts, Brendan Stone from Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, will help us continue to admit people as people are still joining in. And I'll stop the share for right now. And I see people are already posting in the chat, so it's always great to hear where people are joining from and what groups and places and cities people are from. So please go ahead and put that in the chat if you'd like. And just to quickly respond to a question in the chat, we are recording this and streaming on Facebook, so you will be able to watch the webinar at a later time or share to friends. So to get us started for tonight, first of all, my name is Janine Solanki. I'm on the coordinating committee of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. And we are joining here today for a very timely webinar titled How Imperialists Use NATO and G7 to Maintain Global Domination. And also, of course, with the demand of Canada out of NATO and the G7. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that as I'm speaking to you all, I am here in Vancouver, and I'm on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I know many of us are joining from across Canada and other parts of the world, and if you are residing on Indigenous territories, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the responsibility that each of us have to Indigenous nations to recognize, respect, and support the historic and inalienable rights of Indigenous nations and our responsibility to participate and be a part of that struggle for the self-determination and rights of Indigenous nations. Tonight's webinar is organized by the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which is made up of over 50 member groups from across Canada, working together against war, occupation, sanctions, and military aggressions. And we are always growing. In a couple of minutes, I'll post more information in the chat. So if you are part of an organization that would like to be part of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, you can definitely join us. And if you'd like to be part of the announcement list, you can also join that list to find out about more events and activities across Canada about anti-war and social justice events, not just from the network, but from our member groups also. So as we're joining here today, we are looking at the very dangerous actions of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and also of the G7. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a US-led nuclear-armed military alliance. And from NATO's founding in 1949 to today, NATO has left a trail of death and destruction, especially since 1990, with their interventions in the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, and now Ukraine. NATO weapons are prolonging the war in Ukraine and genocide in Gaza. Since 2022, Canada sent $4 billion in so-called military aid to Ukraine to prolong a NATO proxy war against Russia, while rejecting negotiations to end the war. Also, NATO calls Israel its vital ally in the Middle East, and allies of NATO continue to, and members of NATO continue to send weapons to the Israeli Zionist regime that is carrying out a brutal genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, which I'm sure many of us are watching and participating in protests against every day, which has killed a staggering 62,000 Palestinians, including 17,500 children. Also, just a few months ago in November, the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network organized a counter summit to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Montreal. And part of that NATO summit was hosting a delegation of Zionist Israel, just going to show that their goal and their actions are not for peace, are not for the betterment of the world, but are for further war, occupation, and in fact, genocide. So as us here on this webinar today, as our speakers and many of the participants and members of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network are organizing against the brutality of imperialist wars and occupations, the covert and overt military operations and crippling sanctions that our world faces, we have to look at what NATO is doing and NATO's role in all of this destruction. Because it's through NATO that imperialist countries manage their war-mongering division of labor. While NATO serves as a dangerous military alliance, the G7 is another imperialist club from which imperialist governments plan their domination of poor and oppressed nations, and we'll be hearing more about this tonight. And this is especially timely because from June 15th to 17th, the G7, made up of the United States, Canada, France, Germany, the UK, Japan, and Italy, is holding their summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. So I'll also will be sharing some more information about upcoming actions that you can get involved in and participate in against the G7 summit, and also the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network statement. Before I open up and go to our fantastic speakers, I don't want to take too much time introducing them or introducing before I go to them. I do want to mention that just today, and I'm sure our speakers will touch on this today also, but just today, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, announced that Canada is putting more funds into the military and actually increasing the military spending to NATO's 2% target by this year. This is half a decade ahead of what they had previously said, and is a huge increase to money going to military, going to fighter jets, going to weapons of destruction, rather than to housing, healthcare, education, and climate solutions. So with this timely webinar, we have speakers, fantastic speakers that will be discussing all of these issues. We have Owen Schulk, who I'll be introducing in a moment, is a Winnipeg-based author. Tamara Lorentz, who is a member of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Canada. And also Barbara Waldron, who is a longtime anti-imperialist activist in BC and South Korea. So I'll introduce them more fully in a moment, but I want to start off with our first speaker, Owen Schulk, who is a Winnipeg-based author. His latest book is Canada in Afghanistan, A Story of Military, Diplomatic, Political, and Media Failure, 2003 to 2023, which was published in 2023, and is also the author of the upcoming book, Targeting Libya, Canadian Dams, Canadian Bombs. And I'll put links for those books in the chat also. So thank you, Owen, for being our first speaker for this evening, and I'll hand the virtual mic over to you.
Great. Thank you, Janine. And thanks to everybody for attending. I just want to start my remarks with a few quotes that I think help to define right off the bat what NATO is and what that means for Canada. And then I'll move more into the topic of NATO expansion and the case for withdrawal as I go on. The first quote is former US President Richard Nixon. He said, quote, "The only collective body that ever worked was NATO. And that was because it was a military alliance and we, meaning the US, were in charge." Another quote from former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, he said somewhat famously, "We, meaning Canada, had no defense policy, so to speak, except that of NATO. Our defense policy determined all of our foreign policy, and we had no foreign policy of any importance except that which flowed from NATO." So if you put these two statements together, what do we see? Well, we see that NATO is controlled by the US government, and NATO determines Canadian foreign policy. Therefore, the US government determines the Canadian government's foreign policy. And it's important that we understand that because in our current moment, NATO is driving the extremely dangerous militarization of global affairs. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, NATO members currently account for over half of all global military spending at 55%. And if NATO members commit to meeting the organization's new 5% of GDP target, which was recently announced by the Secretary General Mark Rutte, then NATO's military expenditures will grow to equal the entire world's current military spending, which is insanity. So NATO is a threat to the world through its imperialist interventions abroad, a threat to global ecology and the climate, of course, through the massive emissions and the environmental degradation of the different military-industrial complexes of NATO's members. And NATO's a threat to all of us as people in Canada, because a $150 billion military budget, which is what our government would spend if we met the 5% target, means fewer homes in Canada, means fewer schools, fewer hospitals, fewer jobs. It means public services drained of funds. So NATO's drive to militarize the world is a threat to all of us here watching and to everybody in our lives, not to mention to the world as a whole. But this isn't new. From its inception, NATO has been a dangerous and aggressive force on the world stage. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, specifically why NATO came into being in 1949, what its purpose was in US foreign policy, how that purpose evolved, and what NATO's function is today. So this alliance, NATO, came into being 76 years ago with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. And as I explain in an upcoming book that I've written for ARP Books on NATO, NATO was the military component of a broader strategy on the part of Washington to subordinate Western Europe and Canada to US economic and political interests. And NATO was the public military component of that campaign, but there were also cultural, economic, and clandestine dimensions to it too, which I'll talk about a bit today. And this is something I want to emphasize. NATO was not and is not a defensive alliance, and it has never existed purely as a military organization. It was and is an aggressive alliance, and it was and is overtly political. We see that, for instance, in the well-known statement from NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, quote, "The purpose of the NATO alliance is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down." And the conclusion that NATO is a political alliance and an aggressive one at that becomes unavoidable, I would argue, the more you delve into this history. So after World War II, Europe was in shambles, and the communist movement had widespread appeal due to the leading role of the Soviet Union and communist partisans in defeating Nazi Germany and its puppets. But there was nothing that the US feared like a communist Western Europe. So it launched this multi-pronged offensive against the continent to keep Western Europe economically and politically subservient. And that agenda continues to this day, of course. The economic side of this post-war offensive was the Economic Recovery Program of 1948, or the Marshall Plan, which aimed to rebuild the continent to conform to US capitalist accumulation patterns, namely Fordism. And the Marshall Plan was explicitly anti-communist. There's a quote from the Marshall Aid Administrator Paul Hoffman where he says, Europe would have been communistic if it had not been for the Marshall Plan. So this was the explicit political goal of the economic dimension of this offensive. There was also a cultural side. And for that, the US government deployed the Congress of Cultural Freedoms to suppress anti-capitalist literature and art and to promote culture more suited to the worldview of the White House and its conservative European allies. As for NATO, it was formed as the military aspect of this wider offensive. And NATO's operations weren't purely or even primarily public. For one, there were the alleged secret anti-communist protocols that member states had to sign before they joined, protocols that said new members would prevent communist parties from taking power, even through elections. And there was Operation Gladio, which was the term for NATO member Italy's secret anti-communist armies and terror operations. But that term, Gladio, has become a term used to refer to NATO's secret armies as a whole. And these armies were involved in coups, assassinations, and terror attacks across Western Europe, and their activities were coordinated at NATO's Clandestine Planning Committee. These programs also included non-NATO members, including Sweden and Franco's Spain. Franco worked closely with NATO to suppress the Spanish left. And these secret armies, again, show the real purpose of America's offensive against post-war Europe. That purpose being the repression of the Western European left and the integration of Western Europe into a US-led capitalist world system. So after the end of the Cold War in 1991, NATO's purpose transformed from pressuring the USSR from the West, while at the same time policing Western European politics to keep them subservient. It transformed into a global US-led military alliance aimed at protecting and serving an increasingly globalized Euro-American capitalist class. And this change in NATO's purpose was a bonanza for arms dealers. Major US weapons manufacturers like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin were very active in pushing NATO expansion. For example, a man named Bruce Jackson, who was the director of strategic planning at Lockheed Martin, also founded the US Committee to Expand NATO. And the Committee to Expand NATO lobbied not only US officials, Jackson effectively became a US diplomat, flying around Central and Eastern Europe and convincing all these newly post-socialist countries to join the US-led Euro-American alliance. Of course, this expansion, while a goldmine for the weapons industry, was in complete contravention to a promise made to Russia about NATO's eastward expansion. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of the not 1 inch east promise made by James Baker to Gorbachev, but it wasn't just James Baker, and it wasn't just one promise. It was repeated promises by Baker, by President George H.W. Bush, by West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and Vice Chancellor Hans-Dietrich Genscher. This is all outlined in a book called Not 1 Inch by M.E. Surratt, which is a newer book, and she's a very decorated American historian on the post-Cold War era. Everybody should check it out. But the U.S. never intended to keep that promise about expansion, because implementing that promise would have meant reining in U.S. capital, and it would have meant leaving these newly capitalist states across Central and Eastern Europe in potentially unstable positions. And NATO's European policy at this point, it was all about securing what they thought of as the gains of the fall of socialism, as well as securing markets for the expansion of Euro-American and primarily U.S. capital. So where does Canada fit into this question of NATO expansion? Because it wasn't just the US pushing expansion. Canada played a very prominent role as well, sometimes even more aggressive than the US. Starting in 1993, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was pushing for Poland to join NATO 6 years before Poland actually joined. According to a 1994 article in the Edmonton Journal, quote, Prime Minister Chrétien said the U.S. plan doesn't move fast enough to incorporate Poland and some other countries into the NATO military alliance. Chrétien made a very alarming statement at that time where he said that the West had a, quote, moral obligation to expand NATO into, quote, those countries that had been enslaved by communism. Of course, Russia was warning against this expansion from the very beginning, long before Putin took power, but those warnings went unheeded. In this era, part of NATO's new globalized agenda was also the destruction of remaining economic alternatives. And we saw that dynamic play out in the collapse of Yugoslavia and NATO's war on Serbia in the 90s. NATO's war decimated and fragmented an already increasingly fragmented Yugoslavian nation and turned it into, in the words of Michael Parenti, a beggar-poor country of cheap labor and rich resources available at bargain prices, defenseless against capital penetration, so divided that it would never reunite. During its war on Serbia, NATO bombed many non-military targets, including sanitation and electricity systems, not to mention libraries, theaters, hospitals, senior care homes, and television and radio stations. The war also ruptured the West's relationship with Russia at the time because Serbia was a close Russian ally, but also China because the US bombed and destroyed China's embassy in Belgrade, which is something that the Chinese government and people still remember very well, even if we've forgotten about it. The Canadian role in this war should also be highlighted. So during the 78-day assault, Canadian CF-18s dropped 530 bombs on Serbia, and Canada overall was the third largest contributing nation to that war, according to a scholar by the name of Benjamin Zyla. After the Serbia War, NATO's aggressions continued with the wars in Afghanistan and, of course, Libya. I published a book on Canada's war in Afghanistan in 2023, and I've written a new one about Canada in Libya, which should be out this fall. But to keep this part relatively short, I would just say that these wars, Afghanistan and Libya, each had their own dynamics and their own internal logics relating to the various players involved, which I try to unpack in my writings. But to simplify, both of those wars represented attempts by NATO to do what NATO has done since its inception. That is, discipline areas of the world that oppose the US-led Atlantic Alliance and extend into those areas Atlantic military power and economic power in order to maintain this post-Cold War unipolar moment where the US dictates how the rest of the world should conduct its affairs. But by the time of the overthrow of Gaddafi in late 2011, it became clear that the unipolar moment of US power would not last forever. Russia and China were becoming increasingly influential global powers, especially China. So what we saw after the destruction of Libya, which was the main African alternative to US power, what we saw was another reorientation of NATO, this time against Russia and against China. And I'll just say, coming toward my conclusion, that NATO expansion was clearly the trigger for the war in Ukraine. Anyone who has honestly researched the history of NATO should know that. And that war in Ukraine has been used by the US and by extension NATO to incapacitate another competitor to the Atlantic Alliance in Russia. And NATO's actions in China seem designed to spark a similar conflict there with the goal of weakening China. NATO powers, including Canada, are conducting provocative operations near China, sailing warships there. And NATO is deepening its cooperation with regional allies in East Asia, like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. And given the devastation that NATO's expansion has wrought around the world, one can only shudder to imagine what NATO warmongers have planned in East Asia. And before I close, I want to talk briefly about Mark Carney, because he came to power promising that the old relationship with the US is over. But so far, all I see is continuity and even deepening military integration. Carney has continued to commit Canada to supporting the global goals of NATO, which is an aggressive, nuclear, US-controlled military alliance. And outside of NATO, even, we remain extremely economically tied to the US war machine and the US economy in general. Now, if in fact the Carney government wanted to forge an independent path in global and domestic affairs, I would argue that it should do two things. One, withdraw from NATO and become a militarily non-aligned power, which would also mean Canada ending its participation in the war in Ukraine and ending its support for the genocide of Palestinians. And two, deepen Canada's economic relationship with the global majority as represented by BRICS. Now, obviously, Carney is not going to do either of those things. So whatever he says about Canadian sovereignty and independence vis-a-vis the United States is nothing but smoke and mirrors. But Canadians who value peace, independence, and more globally equitable international setups know what Canada must do to support that vision. And it does not mean continuing to support US imperialism and warmongering around the world. What it does mean is finding new economic relationships outside the US, outside the G7, and it means completely and unconditionally withdrawing from NATO. And I'm so glad that there are a large number of Canadians who agree with me and who are willing and eager to organize around those demands. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen, for being a speaker on tonight's webinar. And I think that's a really comprehensive and important outlook of the last many years of Canada's participation in NATO and what we are demanding for Canada to get out of NATO. I'm going to quickly share my screen and just let everyone know that you can get your own copy, as was stated earlier, of Owen's book, Canada in Afghanistan, A Story of Military, Diplomatic, Political, and Media Failure, 2003 to 2023, which is available at Lorimor Brooks. And I'll post that link in the chat again, and also his upcoming book, which I'll flip to here, which is titled Targeting Libya, Canadian Dams, Canadian Bombs. So I'll share those links in the chat. And Owen, when can people look for this latest book to come out?
This one should be out in September of this year.
Great. Thank you so much, Owen. And I'm going to now go on to our next speaker. Tamara Lorentz is a PhD student at the Basili School of International Relations at the University of Waterloo. Tamara is a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada. And Tamara often brings a wealth of information and next steps and actions for all of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network members and many others across Canada to participate in. So thank you very much, Tamara, for being part of the webinar tonight.
Thank you, Janine, and good evening, everyone. It's so nice to be with you all. A big thanks to the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network for hosting this webinar. And it's also great to be on a panel with Owen and with Barbara. I really appreciate their work and their writings. And Owen, we are with you. Canada out of NATO, Canada out of the G7. So I have a PowerPoint presentation to share, and I will just get it up on my computer here, share. And hopefully you all see it okay. So I am going to talk tonight about some troubling G7 and NATO statements and developments. Then I'm going to close by sharing a little bit of hope and what activists are doing to push back and some upcoming events. So the G7, as Janine said, is the 6 NATO countries: Canada, the US, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Council, and Japan. And Japan is a NATO ally, of course. The G7 is effectively NATO. They are one in the same. NATO is the military alliance, and the G7 is the economic alliance. And the United States dominates both of them. In May, the G7 finance ministers and the central bank governors released a statement about their priorities. And 3 of them are, number 1, stopping terrorist financing, 2, supporting critical supply chains in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 3, continuing the unwavering support for Ukraine. Notice the critical mineral supply chain, that's very much for continuing to produce weapons. And notice that they are calling for their unwavering support for Ukraine, but they are silent about Israel's genocide in Gaza. And what is the real objective of the G7 and NATO? It's to protect this unjust world order that has repeatedly been articulated by the NATO Secretary Generals. This is what the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said last year. He said this quote many times, quote, "Together with NATO allies, we account for 50% of the world's economic might and 50% of the world's military might. And we have to remember that the US has never fought alone in a war. They've always been together with all of the other allies. NATO protects 1 billion of our civilians." Now think about that. The 32 wealthy Western countries control 50% of the global economy and the global militaries. Yet there are 193 countries in the United Nations system, and this G7 NATO world order excludes the majority of them. 161 countries representing 7 billion people. They're outside of this. The G7 NATO world order is profoundly racist, avaricious, and vicious. And how did the G7 NATO achieve this domination? Through mass violence and mass plundering that Owen was just articulating, by bombing and breaking up Yugoslavia, bombing and occupying Afghanistan, bombing Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and Palestine. It is the same playbook every time. The US and NATO arms rebels, demonize and assassinates leaders, divides communities, manufactures atrocities, ignores peace proposals, enacts punishing sanctions, and devastates communities, all with no accountability. And this is the playbook that has been used for the proxy wars in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. They are both NATO proxy wars financed by the G7. And this is what the British Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, admitted on Sky News on May 25th. It's all related. Israel is fighting a proxy war on behalf of the UK, just like Ukraine is on behalf of Western Europe against Russia. Similarly, in a Telegraph interview in November of last year, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson admitted the same thing, quote, "We're morally responsible for their Ukrainian predicament. We helped to create this nightmare. Let's face it, we're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the tools to do their job. For years and years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. It's been cruel." Marco Rubio also on March 6th of this year admitted that it's a NATO-Ukraine proxy war against Russia. And remember, in April of 2022, Boris Johnson went to Kyiv to tell Zelensky not to negotiate with Russia and to fight instead. And that is the same month that Zelensky said, "Make Ukraine the Israel of Europe." And that's also when the Atlantic Council released their roadmap for making Ukraine the Israel of Europe. So I want to show you a map that I made to try to make sense of what is going on and how all of these conflicts are connected and what the US and NATO are planning with the economic support of the G7. Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan are the 3 proxies of NATO and part of a 3-front war against Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea for the control of Eurasia. The US and NATO allies have been wanting to control this huge landmass, which is rich in natural resources, since the end of the Cold War, and they have been maneuvering to take it over for 30 years. They want Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea they want to do to these 4 countries what they did to Yugoslavia, Libya, and Syria so successfully, bomb and break them apart. So you can see that Russia, Iran, North Korea are ringed by 750 U.S. NATO military bases and 11 U.S. commands. The U.S. and NATO have, subjugated and plundered Latin America and Africa and so much of Asia, and now they're going after these countries. And they're very overt about this. On May 30th, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, he laid it out in a major address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, in which he called China an imminent threat, and the U.S. and NATO are preparing for war with it. Yesterday, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also outlined this plan in a major hawkish speech in Chatham House in the UK. Rutte said, Russia has teamed up with China, North Korea, and Iran. They are expanding their militaries and their capabilities. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. There is no longer East or West. There is just NATO. China is also modernizing, and it's expanding its military at breakneck speed. Those who stand against freedom and democracy are digging in, preparing for long-term confrontation and trying to dominate and divide us. Unquote. This is doublespeak. It is the exact opposite. It is NATO that is starting the confrontation and the chaos. Rutte also said that NATO allies would commit to 5% GDP target, an increase in military spending at the upcoming NATO summit, precisely to prepare for this global war. On the same day, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, released his plan to meet the NATO 2% target this year, as Janine mentioned. And this is going to mean an immediate injection of $9 billion to the military. In the past 10 years, Canada's military spending has increased 100% to $41 billion last year, and now we're going to go over $50 billion, and we are also going to make a commitment to increase military spending in the next decade to 5% of GDP. But friends, we have to work really hard to stop this. So Canada is currently ranked 16th highest, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as Owen mentioned, and of the 25 highest military spenders, it's mostly the NATO countries. And according to CIPRI's arms transfers, the NATO countries are also mostly in the top 25 for weapons deals. Canada's ranked 16th highest for arms transfers. So NATO really is a weapons dealer, and all of this militarization will cause mass immiseration of our population and exacerbate climate and ecological breakdown. We are experiencing again horrendous wildfires across our country. I want to mention that last year, NATO, with Canada's, of course, support, established a Center of Excellence for Climate and Security. I wrote an article that was in the Canadian Dimension called Greenwashing NATO. This is a greenwashing exercise. If we are serious about protecting the climate and protecting the environment, the most important thing that we need to do is abolish NATO. So here is a glimmer of hope in this horrible sea of despair. 2 weeks ago, on May 27th, the 11 ASEAN countries and the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council and China, they all met in Kuala Lumpur, and they released a really important statement. Here's a quote from it. We endeavor to promote peace, security, stability, and prosperity through mutual respect and cooperation between countries to achieve development and progress based on adherence to international law, including the UN Charter and the principles of good neighborliness. And we appreciate China's crucial role in promoting peace, stability, prosperity, and sustainable development in regional and international affairs. That same month, China and Indonesia also had a bilateral meeting to mark the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. This was the conference between the newly independent Asia Pacific countries. It was held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. And this is what the Indonesian president, Subianto, said just last month. I want to express my respects to the People's Republic of China, which has consistently defended the interests of developing countries. They've consistently opposed oppression, opposed imperialism, opposed colonialism, and opposed apartheid. The People's Republic of China supported liberation struggles in all countries, not just at the present when China's economy has been strong, but even when China was still developing. China continued to defend liberation struggles everywhere, and until today, we see China especially defending the Palestinian people, which is truly something that makes us all so proud. From my heart and on behalf of the Indonesian people, we express our respect to the leadership of the People's Republic of China in defending the oppressed people all over the world. And our country, with the other NATO countries, are right now preparing for war with China. This is an outrage. I also want to mention that China and Indonesia are part of the BRICS, and this is another hopeful development. As Owen mentioned, last September, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia for the Women's BRICS meeting. It was a real honor to be there with women from all around the world who are mobilizing to use the BRICS platform for cooperation and sustainable development. And I also want to mention that today is the first UN International Day of Dialogue Among Civilizations. Dialogue serves as a bridge to find common ground in addressing pressing challenges of our time, ultimately contributing to world peace, human welfare, development, and progress. This is what humanity wants, but this is what NATO and the G7 are preventing. They don't want dialogue and sustainable development. They want domination and war. So it is up to us to engage in people-to-people diplomacy and dialogue. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are not our enemies. They are our neighbors. Finally, I want to bring to your attention two excellent podcasts hosted recently by Dr. Pascal Lotaz of Neutrality Studies. So one is about the NATO People Summit and protest that is going to be taking place later this month. And the other podcast was an interview with Dr. Danielle Ganser, who wrote the book about NATO's secret army. So please check those out, and I'll put a link in the chat. This Sunday, June 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern, UNAC is having a webinar against NATO. The following Sunday, on June 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern, the Global Women United for Peace Against NATO, of which I am a part, and VOW and WILP are as well. They will be having a live stream from the People's Counter Summit Against NATO in the Netherlands. And then June 24th and 25th, there will be a massive protest against NATO in The Hague, and they will also have a live stream. I would love it, friends, if we across Canada could do actions on the 24th and 25th publicly to say Canada out of NATO. And then my last hopeful sign, of course, is the global March for Gaza on June 15th. This march is so wonderful, as well as the attempt to break the siege by the Madeleine. So friends, let's stick together. Let's work for peace and justice. Canada out of NATO, Canada out of the G7, Canada out of NATO, Canada out of the G7. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. As I rightfully introduced you as someone that is always sharing the next action with us, I'm really pleased that you ended your talk on what's next and what we can do and how we can get involved. And on a hopeful note, because I think despite all of the horrific things that we see around the world today, especially in Gaza, we are also needing to keep up our inspiration and our hope, and looking around the world and seeing that people are organizing, people are hitting the streets, people are coming together. And that is absolutely critical, that we recognize that we are the majority, that we are people coming together and organizing together. And when we do that, we are a force, a political force that can really change this world. So thank you so much, Tamara. And then on the note of actions and what we can do and what's ahead of us, I'm going to invite up Barbara Waldron. Barbara is a longtime anti-imperialist activist in BC and South Korea for just peace and democratic rights. She is currently the coordinator for Just Peace Committee and is on the BC Anti-Militarization Campaign Committee of the ILPS. And Barbara has an MA in social science and post-bac diploma in social policy at SFU. So I'll pass the virtual mic over to Barbara.
Thanks. I'm glad we ended up with this sequence of speakers because I certainly agree with both. What I'm going to say fits in with both. So our views, our understanding, and our collected knowledge is very compatible. So I totally agree with Tamara that G7 is pretty much NATO. And what they're meeting to talk about is the NATO agenda. Their primary consideration is security. And what they mean is what Owen said, defending the capitalist class. And along with that, as their wealth is declining, the militarization is expanding. So later I'll tell you about our anti-imperialist and anti-militarization campaign. So Tamara told us what the G7 is. It's a block of countries. If you look at them, they all have been colonial countries. Japan as well was a major colonial force in Asia, right? And all of them except Japan are the founding nations of, or some of the founding nations of NATO. So these are the most advanced, or have been the most advanced industrialized countries, consider themselves democracies, bourgeois or liberal democracies, limited democracies. Russia used to be included. It used to be the G8. And it does have observer members like Ukraine, and Zelensky is invited, is going to be at this meeting coming up in Alberta. And the European Union is having a special role. And there are 7 of them. So every 7 years, Canada comes up for its turn as the host. It has hosted. It has hosted the G7 before. The last time was in 2018. It hosted in Kananaskis, which is the Rocky Mountains, right? The recreational area in the Rocky Mountains between near Banff and near Calgary. It hosted there in 2004, and that was the height of the anti-globalization movement. So there were 10,000 people that protested, and there was quite a big clash of interests with the protesters getting right up to close to the venue. But this year, the venue is being even more fortified, and all the city of Calgary and the airport are all fortified. Banff is fortified. We'll talk about that in a bit. So these countries are among the richest, and today they have somewhere between 25.5% to 29%. There's some sources that say it's a little higher. I just did some digging. According to statistic.com and visualcapitalist.com, these countries had a combined share of the global GDP of 66% of the GDP in 1990. So what's happened then? There have been crisis after crisis, right? And with crisis after crisis, there's been more and more militarization. And that's around the time that where Owen said the NATO shifted to become the defender of the capitalist class in the world. And its militarization extended. And he talked about the Yugoslav war, Jean Chrétien, the prime minister at the time, pushing to expand NATO and NATO expanding the Yugoslav war. So this, all this militarization and intensified war and war industry has increased as the decline of their share of the global GDP occurs. In 2022, they had 40% of the global GDP. This is not long after 2025, and it's 25.5, maybe 29%. So they are worried. And they know that this is an opportunity for not only their rival countries, rival states to benefit, and that a lot of the wealth of the world is shifting to other countries. You know, of course, Russia, Brazil, India, China's economies are all growing. But it's also an opportunity for liberation struggles. And we can see that they really don't want any liberation struggle to succeed. And that's what Palestine, digging their heels into the Palestine struggle, is all about, as well as the ideologies and so on surrounding that. So that is my thesis, and our thesis in the ILPS. So just go through this. We go through all the countries so you can look at how much wealth they have and how much they're involved in militarization. So I just wanted to highlight Canada because, as was pointed out by Tamara, our Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced further militarization. This is a solution, he says, to getting Canada more independence and building our nation. Of course, it's totally false. Militarizing our economy and our country and joining in the military campaigns in the world is not benefiting the people of Canada or any of the people anywhere else. And it's a contradiction. There's nothing here about defending our sovereignty. In fact, he is kowtowing to NATO and the NATO agenda, which means kowtowing to the US and its role in the world. And they're just as desperate to maintain their hegemony over the world. So we just go through all these countries. I'll just skip through this. Oh, sorry. Okay. So hand in hand with their economic agenda of trying to protect markets, keep the profits rolling in, while most of the world becomes poorer and poorer, and the people who share most of the wealth are fewer and fewer. They are militarizing, using the war industry for profits, and all this spin off the communications industries and so on, IT, communication, AI, and so on with this. And this is why, for example, G7 is going to talk about AI so much. So these are other alliances along with NATO. There is the one in Asia, Australia, UK, US alliance. They all have developed an Indo-Pacific strategy, and they're all building on former agreements and pacts. They're nuclear armed countries. The US, of course, is the only one that's used it. They're threatening to use them again. It's very dangerous in terms of the potential for nuclear war today. NATO has made a recommitment to nuclear weapons. Tamara talked about the Russia-Ukraine war, what that's all about, expanding NATO, trying to challenge Russia, exploiting the people of Ukraine and the situation there, pretending they're for peace and democracy. So the economic program of neoliberalization, it goes hand in hand with their military, their security agenda, of course. So they've tried to continue to enslave other countries through their lending programs and dominating the markets for lands and seed and all the minerals and energy, privatizing all of that and trying to monopolize that. And we know Canada is very much involved in the minerals and energy, is a leader and a provider, minerals and energy to the war machine. As I said, the AI is on the agenda. They're not really revealing a whole lot about that. So preparing for the G7 summit, there was the Foreign Ministers Summit held in Banff earlier in the year. And this is where we could see the whole agenda. They're talking about what's going on in other countries and what they should be doing in other countries. So it has nothing to do with improving their own societies and building their own nations and helping the people in their own countries. They're really concerned with their status in the world and world domination, and they're planning more aggression, more militarization for that. Okay, so the agenda, as we said, from international peace and security to global economic stability and growth to digital transition. Today's global challenges and opportunities require us to work to find shared solutions. But the solutions for the tiny minority that rules the world and not for us, when they talk about security and defense, is to defend their own role. So ILPS in Canada, which is the International League of People's Struggle, is answering this situation by developing its own anti-militarization program. And so this year they targeted the CANSAC Arms Trade Show. So we were part in organizing that and in protesting there. And I should say, I'm mentioning ILPS because I'm with Just Peace Committee and they're a member organization. So I've been on the organizing committee to plan the next target, the demonstration and the counter summit next weekend in Alberta to challenge the G7. So we're protesting the G7 on principle. We should challenge, confront these leaders when they're there right in our land or in our own country. And we should challenge what they're doing in the world. But more importantly, it's another chance to bring together more organizations, to build our understanding together, to talk together and share some activities and build our movement together. That's the most important thing. It will take millions and millions of people opposing what they're doing to the point where we can influence the young people that go into the military and the police forces. When we can influence them and they question what's going on, then the people's movements can win. The third thing that we're going to do this year is on the west side of the country. There is the aerospace and defense exhibition, which we haven't been protesting, but now we think we're in a position to do that. It takes place just outside the Vancouver metro area in the Fraser Valley, and air show happens at the same time, and they are part of the whole exhibition. So it's mostly a military air show. We'll be doing that in August. And then you can ask me for more questions. What's coming up with, oh, right, I'm going to share the material. Do you see that, or do I have to change the share?
I just shared for you in the chat the information and link to the G7, okay. But yeah, so that.
There's a flyer, and hopefully, oh, there's 3 pages to this. So yeah, and then the registration link, I'll put in the registration link. There's still time if you can get there. It's harder to get there because the hotels and everything are filling up, and as I said, they're going to have checkpoints. They're going to try and limit the demonstration areas. Of course, we have a plan to march on Sunday the 15th, the day after our People's Summit. We have a plan to go to some of the consulates of the G7 countries and an energy firm building, as well as a Canada government building. So we'll see what happens. Right now, we have over 100 people registered for our People's Summit on the Saturday. It'll be downtown and also downtown. We're meeting at City Hall because there's some climate activists demonstrating there, and we're joining some church people that have had, Kairos Canada has had their Jubilee, their annual social justice conference for timed to challenge the G7. So we'll be meeting them as well. We expect to have 200 to 500 people marching with us, but we realize there'll be all these other causes, anti-Trump, nationalist causes, maybe the Zionists and the Alberta separation people. And we understand that there's going to be no King Day in the US, so there'll probably be sympathizers. I certainly sympathize with that. So that's what we're doing in Alberta, and I'll answer questions if you want. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to all of our speakers, our excellent speakers. I think we really had a great lineup of speakers today to go through a comprehensive history of what NATO and G7 is and how we need to organize and how we can organize against NATO. And against the G7. So thank you to all of our great speakers. A couple of things I wanted to just mention. I've posted a few things in the chat. One is the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network's statement against the G7, so you can read that there. And also, I've posted a couple of times, and I'll post again, how you can follow the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and how your member organization can get involved with the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and join the over 50 groups across Canada that is part of this important network, organizing on many different anti-war and social justice issues, but especially on our campaign of Canada out of NATO. So we are going to open up for a question and answer period. We'll be doing that by taking questions that are posted in the chat. And I'll be reading them out to our speakers for them to respond to. I've seen a few questions already in the chat that I will read through. I'll read a few at a time for the speakers to respond to. And then if you have any other questions, please post them in the chat. So the first question is, first of all, one that has been responded to by a few people, but and anyone can also post this in the chat, is a request for easily digestible and accessible resources, such as a short documentary that would summarize the history of NATO's imperialism and goals to share with others. I'm sure our speakers have some resources, and I think a few people have posted in the chat already, but I'll open that for any of our speakers to respond to. And also a question about the genocide in Gaza and understanding that the Zionists want to take over the land of Palestine and Gaza, despite that they're destroying it and making it uninhabitable for many years. But the question is, what does NATO get out of the genocide in Gaza in terms of military contracts, oil off the coast of Gaza, or any other reasons? So I'll start with those two questions, and I'll ask if any of our speakers would like to respond to that.
Sure, I can start on the second question about Gaza. I think in order to answer that question, we should think about what function Israel has served throughout its existence. It's always been an extension of Western military power. Just look at the countries that Israel has targeted. Nasser's Egypt was one of the first. Now, yes, it's Gaza, it's Palestine, also Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran. Any country that aligns itself with the so-called axis of resistance, Israel is there to discipline them and to overthrow them if need be. And there was an article published during the late Biden administration. I think it was in the Huffington Post first, and then it was sort of disseminated throughout US media, which laid out what they called the Biden doctrine for Gaza. And they quote several officials in the Biden administration, specifically Brett McGurk, who served in many Democratic and Republican administrations, advising them on foreign policy. And they outline what the Biden administration's plan for Gaza was should the genocide have succeeded while he was in power. And the plan was destroy Gaza, wipe out Palestinian resistance forces in Gaza, and then have the Gulf monarchies come in to rebuild Gaza, quote unquote, and to have the new Gaza aligned geopolitically with the US. After that, the plan was to divert US military resources toward Iran, also Syria, but that mission accomplished there as far as the US and Israel are concerned. And then after either overthrowing the Iranian government or sufficiently weakening the Iranian government, then the US would shift its military resources toward China. And I don't think this Biden doctrine has changed in the Trump administration. I think it's now the Trump doctrine for Gaza. So yes, the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza that the West is supporting, it is about resources, like regional resources, regional power. But it's not just about that region. It's also about Western hegemony more broadly, wiping out Palestinian resistance to then wipe out resistance in the region to then target major geopolitical competitors like China. Yeah, I think that analysis really highlights what the Western plan for Gaza is.
Thanks, Owen. Tamara, go ahead.
Can I just add to what Owen said, that just think about the fact that Israel was established out of the British Mandate in 1948 at the same time that NATO was established. And when you look back at the history, some of the older text on NATO, it will talk about the role that Israel has played to try to suppress communist movements in the Middle East. It was also directed against the Soviet Union. And then also think about the fact that in 1989, US President Ronald Reagan made Israel a major non-NATO ally for the alliance, and then Israel became part of the Mediterranean dialogue and started to do a lot of exercises with the alliance in the 1990s. This also allowed for more arms transfers between the NATO allies and Israel. And then in 2016, Israel established an office right inside the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And 3 days after the Hamas attack, Israel had a meeting with the NATO allies, and they coordinated on weapons transfers. So this is why I say that the genocide in Gaza is not just a U.S.-Israeli genocide. It is also a NATO genocide. NATO is deeply involved in this. They're totally complicit, and they're arming it and funding it. And then on the resources, I would like to just bring to your attention, if you go to wilpcanada.ca, I'll put a link in the chat. There is a tab that says resources, and there's a whole bunch of 2-page fact sheets. And so I have a fact sheet that I've done on NATO in French and English that you can download and pass out. And I also want to address something in the chat where people said about what we should do to take on NATO and calling for Canada to get out of the alliance. Last year, I was able to successfully get a parliamentary petition introduced in the House by my member of Parliament calling for Canada out of NATO, and she actually read most of it into the Hansard, into the public record. I would like to urge you all, and I'll put my email in the chat, to call on your member of Parliament to host a parliamentary petition to call for Canada out of NATO. I think that would be really fantastic. And then I also think that public protests are important. I think it's important for the public to see Canadians with signs, bravely saying Canada out of NATO. And as well, take letters, take my 2-page fact sheet to your member of Parliament office and say Canada out of NATO. We need to do everything. We need to do everything that we can to bring down this warmongering alliance, but we are not alone. We are working with allies around the world trying to disband NATO. So just do whatever you feel comfortable doing and keep doing it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I'd like to see if any of our other speakers would like to respond on those questions. If not, I will go on to a couple of other questions. One is, I am wondering if anyone can speak to the US-EU split in the context of Canada's pivot towards the EU, rearm Europe, and the coalition of the willing, which seeks to put boots on the ground in an unsanctioned, illegal, dirty war in Ukraine. So important question there. And then also another question about invitations by Carney to President Modi of India and Salman al-Saud is a sign of irresponsible militarism, also by not inviting Pakistan as well. And what about not inviting Lula da Silva from Brazil? Carney tries to lure countries away from the Shanghai Organization and from BRICS. And then one other question that I'll put to the speakers, and maybe we'll take another round of questions after this before we wrap up. So the question is, the Nova Scotia government is asking for mining exploration proposals, including in my neighborhood. What happens to uranium mined in Canada, and does some go into nuclear weapons or end up being used in depleted uranium bombs? So I'll put those to our three speakers.
Well, just on I think it was the first question about was it US-Canada split or US-EU split, and Canada trying to tighten its relationship with EU, is that right? Okay. Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a canard, but I see Mark Carney as a loyalist. So if you look at the history of US-Canada relations, with the US breaking away from British colonialism with a revolution against the monarchy, for certain classes, a set of the establishment in Canada, they think of Canada in terms of British Canada, British colonial Canada, and they're trying to extend and continue that kind of legacy and identity, those kinds of relations. Of course, there's a lot of conflict with Indigenous people, migrant people, and working class in general against that. But I think that's why Carney invited the King of England here, because a lot of people say, well, what's our identity? Well, we're not the US. So I would say he's a loyalist, he and his cronies, and identify with the British monarchy and the British history, of being an extension of British colonialism, and want to cling to that identity. But then there's also opportunities because of breakdown in the economy and the political systems in the European Union. It's just a practical matter to try to create trade and find opportunities with them. That's another dimension of it, I would say. And then I think that they all are grounded in protecting themselves. They're going to work together to protect themselves, and the G7, the NATO summits show that, even though there is a lot of rivalry. So that's the contradictions of the time, and this time of crisis. There are more rivalries, there's more instability among them, and they're trying to create chaos and more militarization to deal with that. Because they're all going to be losers eventually, but they're hoping that some of them are going to be able to hang on and stay winners. There's like Naomi Klein has written about the apocalypse kind of mentality. You know, the apocalypse is coming, Armageddon is coming, we've got to save ourselves. So that's why they're attacking the immigrants and going on their warmongering so much because they feel there are going to be certain people left. They're going to hang on to human civilization and all that nonsense. So those are some of my thoughts. They're not really together as an analysis on that question. I'm not sure about the other matters, so I'll let the other people answer.
Well, I can just add a little bit on the EU-US split and what that means geopolitically. So I don't view the EU as operating separately from US power and US geopolitical objectives. I think there is clearly disagreement between those who rule Europe and the Trump administration over how to proceed in Ukraine. We see Europe undertaking rearmament through Rearm Europe, which Canada is participating in, as Carney has now announced. In one sense, Rearm Europe is Europe's statement to the US that, yeah, we're going to keep arming Ukraine with or without you. But on the other hand, it also serves Trump's global agenda and his vision for NATO, which is Europe spends more on its own defense so that the US spends less there. So the tensions are there most clearly in Ukraine. And another commenter brought up China and the question of whether or not Europe would go along with increased US aggression toward China. I think it seems to me that the European ruling class is focused right now on Russia and would prefer to prolong the war against Russia as opposed to pivoting to a new war against China. But I also think that the European ruling class is so spineless and so lacking in imagination that if the US were to stoke a war with China, Europe would just go along with it. We saw how the EU rolled over with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, for instance, with the blowback of the anti-Russia sanctions on European economies. They all doubled down. So Europe's leaders are utterly lacking in imagination and in vision. And to me, this just confirms that the future is with the global majority. It's with BRICS. It's not with the G7. It's not with NATO. And again, that just reaffirms that Canada needs to get out of these alliances and to diversify and deepen its relationships with the global South.
Just to add, I think that the U.S. Secretary of State of Defense, Peter Hegseth, spelled it out precisely in February in his first overseas trip, and that was in Germany, when he said that the United States was going to stop or kind of draw down a little bit from its support of Ukraine to leave it to the European Union because they are taking on China in the Indo-Pacific. So remember that map that I showed? They are just wanting the European Union to ramp up weapons production so that they can fight the war against Russia, and Israel is going to take on the Middle East, and the United States is going to focus on China. So that's the way I see it, and that's what Peter Hegseth basically said. I'd really encourage you to read his speech. And then on the issue of uranium, you know, I used to live in Nova Scotia, and we fought really hard to prevent uranium mining happening in that province. So I'm very disappointed to hear this news. But one of the reasons why all of our countries are now so wanting to upscale uranium mining and nuclear energy is because of what Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, said in his 3-hour speech hearing in front of Senate last month, and that was the plan for the United States to to dominate AI. So all of these data centers for AI need a lot of land, they need a lot of water, and they need a tremendous amount of energy. And they are expecting to use nuclear for the AI data centers, which they want to put all over the world, including in Africa. And I think we need to really pay attention to the critical mineral mining that's going to be happening across Canada, in Nova Scotia, in Ontario for AI, for weapons production. It's going to use a lot of natural resources that are going to, degrade our natural environment and exacerbate global warming. So this is another huge fight that we have on our hands, but we need to be in solidarity with First Nations communities that are fighting on this issue. And then I also just want to quickly address India and why India has been invited to the G7. And this is, of course, because the plan all along, since the Indo-Pacific strategy that was announced by the United States and by Canada in 2022, was because the G7 countries are trying to pull India away from China and Russia into their orbit so that they can use India as a partner and as a place to help conduct these wars. But I'm very glad that India has a close relationship with Russia, and we need to encourage India to have good relations with all of its neighbors. So there's only deleterious, pernicious motives by the G7 to bring in India here, and it's nothing like the BRICS at all. And then finally, I will put a link in the chat. There's been some stuff in the chat about what I've said about China, and I just really want to encourage people to check out Vijay Prasad's important article and his work about Bandung and the Bandung Conference and what it meant and how NATO and the US crushed the Bandung spirit and prevented the development of the developing countries, the newly colonial countries, and why they're working so hard to try to develop in partnership with China. And this is something that we should recognize and that we should support and applaud China for.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I'm just going to read out the two last questions from our chat. They're kind of related to a few things that have already been said, but I'll just put them out there in case there are any other additions that our speakers would like to make, and that will be our last round of questions for our discussion for today as we're drawing near the end of our webinar. So the first is, do speakers anticipate seeing divisions surface between the imperialist powers at the G7? There are serious trade tensions between them. Europe seems less eager to go to war with China, and the US appears less committed to defending Ukraine compared to Western Europe and Canada. How can divisions, and I think a lot of that was discussed, but the question is, how can divisions between imperialists be used as opportunities for peace movements? And then another question, if polls were taken in most European countries, how many would vote to abolish NATO? Why did Finland and Sweden join NATO immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine? And I know Tamara has a response to that. I know there are polls out there, and there's a very big difference between the governments and the people of these countries. So I'll hand that over to our speakers before we wrap up, and also any other comments to wrap up that our speakers would like to make, please go ahead and do so.
I'll just go for because I'm sure the other two can elaborate further. Divisions between the imperialists, yes, there always have been, because they're always competing each other for kudos, for status, for wealth, domination, etc. So that's just part of the whole makeup of the system. But today, of course, the US is becoming more and more isolated, and there are rifts between everybody in the US and among themselves. And it has to do with particular policies, particularly economic developments, like Germany, for example, and their histories. So in relation to Ukraine, in relation to Palestine and the Zionist entity. And yes, we take advantage of that. Um, and it's time to really educate people, make sure they know and understand what imperialism is. And I think imperialism used to be a difficult word to say because you would get a dazed look, or people would say, oh, you're some kind of real extremist because you're saying the word imperialist. But the political environment has changed a lot today. People understand what imperialism is. We can see what it's doing, how it operates to dominate, exploit, and plunder. Um, and result in impoverization and massive death and destruction. And so we can build on these sentiments and bring people together with a common understanding. But it takes a lot of work, a lot of pavement pounding and knocking on doors, and time to talk with people. But it has to be done. Um, and one question: NATO is a very big part of organizing. So more and more people understand that there is something called NATO, and they're questioning its role more. I think because of the work of activists in particular, we want to in our Peace and Justice Network and in ILPS and other formations, coalitions, we want to popularize this line, get Canada out of NATO. We want people to understand that NATO is not defending them and democracy and helping peace develop. It's for exactly the opposite of that. So this is a very important area of work. It's um, a foundation of imperialism, right? The NATO alliance. So we need to work on that. And there are certain targeted campaigns, like migrant labor is another one that it's so important today for people to understand and make the connections and unite in their struggle for a day when we can build a different kind of society. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Tamara or Owen, which of you would like to go first?
I can go first because I feel like Tamara will have a very good, rousing close to the session. But on the point about G7 tensions, so after World War II, the US came into Europe and sort of bound Europe together through its economic and military might. And it continues to serve that big brother role today. And throughout the Cold War, there were also tensions amongst European powers. So de Gaulle was quite anti-NATO. There was even briefly some West German interest in trading with the Soviets. But then the US always bonked their heads together and reminded them who was in charge. So until the US loses its interest and its dominant role in Europe, which it isn't now, despite what some might say, I don't think those divisions will prove fatal to that alliance at all. I think the meaningful challenges to NATO, to imperialism, come from outside the imperial war. We can look at China, of course. We can look at the alliance of Sahel states in Africa, in Latin America. There's Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So in my mind, those are the real areas where imperialism is being challenged and threatened. And on the point about Sweden and Finland joining NATO, I don't know a whole lot about Finland, but in the case of Sweden, Sweden was always very, very close with NATO. They had a secret stay-behind network during the Cold War, even though they weren't an official NATO member, and they collaborated very closely with the U.S. and with the other NATO powers throughout that time. I think Sweden's accession to NATO was largely a formality. It was already a de facto member. Um, and yeah, that's what I'd say about that. I think just to reiterate again, the real challenges to imperialism come from outside the imperial core. Those are the ones that I find inspiring. Those are the ones that I watch the most closely. And I would advise others to watch them very closely as well.
I couldn't agree more, Owen, and thank you for that that reminder. Tamara, go ahead. Thank you.
So I've got lots of peace friends in Finland and in Sweden, and both of them have said that it was like a coup d'etat that their countries joined NATO. But if you look at WikiLeaks, if you do a search on Finland and Sweden in WikiLeaks, you will see that the NATO has been maneuvering, has been working slowly, covertly in both those countries to get them to join NATO at the opportune time. Finnish forces and Swedish forces, partnered on NATO training and on different NATO interventions. So this was long planned in both countries, but it was very much opposed by the people, because it's going to mean more military spending and breaking off close relationship with Russia. In November of 2022, I took a bus because the trains no longer run between Helsinki and St. Petersburg, and I had to take a bus from St. Petersburg to Helsinki, and now that bus has even ended. But on that bus, there were so many people from Finland, so many people from Russia, because there's so many connections there. If you look at what NATO has been doing along Russia's border, it's been very much dividing Europe and Russia. And what our responsibility is to create bridges between our countries, Europe and Russia. Russia is our Arctic neighbor. So it is going to be up to us to take responsibility and build bridges of peace and solidarity and friendship, because we are neighbors. So friends, let's continue to work together to build a mass movement in this country to call for Canada out of NATO. And we are not alone. We are working with allies and comrades around the world who are doing that exact same thing. So let's stick together.
I think those are the most important words to end on, Tamara. And before people start dropping off, I want to make a couple of quick points. First of all, of course, a big thank you to our excellent speakers. Really took us through a lot of information in a short amount of time and responded very well to all of our questions. So thank you so much for being part of our webinar tonight. I want to also let people know that our upcoming action or upcoming campaign of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network is going to be a new sign-on letter asking MPs to not join CANA, which is the Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association, which is a body within the Parliament that is promoting NATO activities. It's actually the largest association of the Canadian Parliament, and it only serves to further ties with NATO. So we are going to be publishing a statement and a sign-on letter that anyone can send to their MPs. So please look out for that. We'll be sending an email to everyone who registered with that information, and it'll be launched in the next few days. Right now is the time after the elections that MPs have. They have 3 months after elections to decide whether or not to join this association. So it's a very important time to put that word out to your newly elected MPs that you do not approve of them joining the Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association. And we'll be doing more actions targeting and talking about this body within the Canadian Parliament that is promoting NATO. Also, I want to just say that as today's webinar is hosted by the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, we really encourage people who are part of anti-war, peace, social justice organizations to join us. We are 50 organizations from across Canada, and we are a very inclusive network. And we focus on building a united front against the critical issues of our time. We have so much that we need to really organize around and act on, organizing against imperialist wars, occupations, and of course the genocide that is unfolding in front of our eyes in Gaza. I will just mention that as we are a very diverse network, we organize together as a united front. We recognize that we don't always agree on everything, but instead of succumbing to sectarianism or divisiveness, we recognize that we are stronger working together, that the issues of genocide, war, and occupation and our united fight for a better world are what is the most important task for anti-war activists, organizations, and all peace-loving people. This is more important than any divisions, and I really am very honored to be part of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and working together with so many great organizations on such important campaigns. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for being part of this important discussion, and most of all, thank you to our three speakers. Have a good night, everyone.